almost crashed an airplane when I was 7 years old. See, I grew up on an airport, and my dad flew these little Cessnas and Pipers, nothing bigger than a four-seater. And I'd fly with them sometimes. And the first time he let me pilot was when I was 7. And we were climbing, and he told me to lower the nose just a little bit. And to my 7-year-old brain, that meant to just go ahead and jam the yoke all the way forward. And we went into a scary dive. But my father was able to regain control pretty quickly, so perhaps it's an exaggeration to say that I almost crashed it, but it still horrified me and could possibly be the genesis of my terrible fear of heights, which I still have to this day. But sometimes you just have to face your fears. And people will tell you that facing your fears is how you defeat them, but that's not always true. And I hate to be the one to tell you this, but sometimes your fears will stay with you no matter how many times you face them. So your bravery needs to be persistent. Dear young men, you are a powerful force, and because of that, there are very opportunistic influences that are constantly seeking to weaponize you, to use you as a soldier for their cause, and they do so by appealing to your fears. Always beware when people appeal to your fears to get you to try to do certain things or to think a certain way. They know that if they're able to get a hold of you while you're young, then they very well may have a lifelong soldier for their cause. In the Bible, in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, that's a double-edged sword, because it can be good advice for a parent, sure, but it can also be sound instruction for the propagandist. Young men, certain forces know that you are vulnerable because you are suffering from various problems which nobody seems to care about. To so many others, you probably feel invisible and disposable. You see, the forces who want to use you have always been around. But the problem is perhaps more pronounced now because the people who should have your back just don't seem to be there for you anymore. Or it seems like they even see you yourself as a problem. So you are in a very vulnerable spot, a crossroads of sorts, a position in which you are in danger of being manipulated by sinister forces to become a soldier for someone else's cause, because they're the only ones left who claim to appreciate you. They are seizing an opportunity. They are seizing you. Now, I know how you feel because I was like you when I was young. I have been a very happy and fulfilled person for a long time now. But when I was a young man, it was quite a different story. I was miserable. And there were two great fears that constantly plagued my life. I was afraid of being homeless, and I was afraid of being alone. And neither of those things came to pass, but they were very real fears at that time. Fears that someone could have easily exploited. You see, I didn't have a sense of self-worth, so I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hire me and pay me enough to survive, let alone experience the American dream. I wanted the American dream, but it didn't even seem like an option to someone like me. My fears of being alone were quite similar. Because of my lack of self-esteem, I couldn't imagine a woman wanting me enough to be in a relationship with me. Well, I was wrong on both accounts. I'm living the American dream, which eludes so many now. Many years ago, I got married to a woman who loves me, and we bought a house, and we had kids, and we're still together to this day, almost 30 years later. People don't always want that. I know some people want different things, and that's okay. We should be okay with that. You just have to know what you want and be accurate about what that is. And surprisingly, that's not always an easy thing to know. Sometimes you can get exactly what you thought you wanted, only to realize it's not really what you wanted after all. But for me, I wanted the American dream. And somehow, beyond all odds, I got it. And it turned out to be what I wanted. But before all that, my life felt very grim and very hopeless, because I desperately wanted that dream, but it felt so far out of reach. And I know that's probably how you're feeling now, and for a very good reason. So there's a very material difference between us, one that presents more challenges for you. See, I grew up in an era in which nobody had cell phones and nobody had the internet. There weren't a million different voices whispering poison into our ears. Your friends called you on the telephone that was attached to your wall, and you made plans to meet up. And you had to hurry up and get off the phone because your parents would complain about the phone bill. And you went out and you met up with your friends in public, and you hung out with other people too, even if you didn't know them. And that's how I met my wife. She was the friend of a friend of a friend. And you went to the club, the bar, the arcade, the mall, the movies, the park, the concert, the car meet, the drive-in, the beach, the block party, and a million other places. And throughout it all, not a single person was on a cell phone. Nobody had Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or YouTube. And I'm not trying to be the old man Luddite shouting at the clouds about kids these days and the evils of technology. No, I don't blame entire generations, and I like technology. But technology can be exploited. People are only people, and technology is only as good or bad as the people who use it. Now, we could still be manipulated back then, of course, but the methods were very different and far more cumbersome. Our pockets were empty of instruments recklessly commandeered for indoctrination by whomever could get the most attention. We didn't have vultures who appropriated the dopamine machine to fill our heads with madness. And the American dream was still available to us because our economic masters had not yet realized just how much we would allow them to take from us. And they will take from us exactly as much as we are willing to give them, which turned out to be far more than any of us imagined. For a young, miserable man without many prospects, everything was about being a badass. Now, I was very heavily into combat sports and weightlifting. I had not just one, but 2 black belts before the UFC even existed. And those eventually became 3rd-degree black belts. And when the UFC started, I was immediately into that. It was a much different sport back then, with only a couple of rules and no weight classes. It was far more brutal. The original Mortal Kombat video game was still new back then. This was back when the only place you could play it was at an arcade. Huge crowds gathered around that machine. It was like a real fight. And I was on the football team, too. All very masculine, macho shit. I was constantly trying to prove myself. And back during those high school days, my best friend and I used to talk about how cool it would be if civilization would just collapse. I think we talked about such things because we were invisible in the real world. We were all latchkey kids raising ourselves. But if everything collapsed, we could finally matter. We could be like Mad Max. Which is very immature and unrealistic. Sometimes I see young men online expressing similar desires today, thinking that it would be fun, like a Fallout video game. And that saddens me. Because not long after high school, I learned exactly what it would be like without civilization. You see, my favorite movie back then was Rambo: First Blood. I never paid attention to the moral lessons of that movie, of course. All I knew about it was that I wanted to do what Rambo could do. And it would be an extra bonus if I could do it for my country, so I joined the army. Amazing, huh? The movie literally told you that Rambo's country fucked him over and threw him away, and apparently the lesson I got from that was sign me up. And it was extremely easy to find a recruiter who was more than happy to take advantage of my naivete as a young, miserable man. And of course, it helped very much that the Army offered me a way out of homelessness, offered to solve a great fear that I had. I wanted as much badass shit as they were able to shove into my contract, but all the badass shit required airborne school, which meant I had to jump out of airplanes, and heights still terrified me. But if I didn't get it in my contract when I enlisted, I'd have to wait years before I could get into airborne school. So I just bit the bullet and signed up for it. And because of all the martial arts and weightlifting, I was in really good shape when I shipped out to basic training, so I took to it really well, despite all the yelling. It was a lot more difficult for most of the others than it was for me. And the drill sergeants even used me to properly demonstrate how to do everything to the rest of our platoon, and sometimes even to the whole company. And I was very proud of that. At last, I was being acknowledged. And not just by anybody, but by the hardest people I had ever met. So I blew through AIT, which is Advanced Individual Training, and my MOS was 11B, which means that I was an infantryman. I immediately went into airborne school after that, which I dreaded, but I did it anyway. And that was much less of a physical challenge and much more of a psychological one. We skipped jumping off the tower due to high winds, so I never got to do that. We went straight to airplanes after 2 weeks of practicing PLFs, parachute landing falls. That's important because we use these old -1 Bravo parachutes, which the Army doesn't even use anymore. They're different from civilian chutes. You see, you're a target in the air, so those chutes dropped you really fast, and you hit the ground hard, so you had to land a specific way in order to avoid breaking your legs. See, my cousin was dropped into Panama, and he told me that his chute was riddled with bullet holes by the time he landed. So getting down fast is important, but it's also dangerous. But that's okay because the Army paid me a whole extra $100 a month for hazardous duty pay. Our first jump kept getting canceled due to high winds. Now we'd prepare, do our checks, go up in the plane, fly around for a bit, and then land. And that happened a couple of times, so we got kind of used to it, expected it even. But then one time, the conditions were right, so we had to jump. The mood on the plane immediately, palpably changed when we realized that we were not going to be landing with the plane that day. A lot of these soldiers were just baby-faced kids. Some of them even started tearing up. And there was one person ahead of me, and he chickened out entirely. He unhooked his static line, which was a big no-no, so they benched him and made me go first. I had to stand in the open door on the side of the fuselage of this C-130 and look at the ground 1,250 feet below and wait for them to tell me to go, which seemed like it took forever. And it was really hard to believe that they really wanted me to jump out of a damn airplane. But when the time came, I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the void, and the noisy world immediately became very quiet. And everyone else followed behind me okay. I was really proud of that too. I'm sure they had no idea how scared I truly was because I hid it well. I refused to show it. Not everyone who jumped had identical levels of bravery, because fear is a requisite of bravery. If you had no fear of jumping, then you didn't need any bravery to do it. But if you had a lot of fear, then you needed a lot of bravery to overcome that fear. And as someone who was afraid of heights, it would have been a lot easier for me to be the 10th person out the door, or the 20th, because I would have seen others do it first, and I could have just followed them. The first person I ever saw jump out of an airplane was myself. And today, now, I'm really glad that I was the first that day, because I had no example to follow. I had to be the example, even though it terrified me. Let me ask you, are you being the example? Or are you just following along? I could have let that first guy who chickened out be the example, and his example would have made it easier for me to do the same. But I did not do the same. By the way, it's bullshit when people say there are no atheists in foxholes. That first guy was a chaplain, and I was an atheist who was scared of heights, yet I gave not a single thought to any god that day. And I never saw that chaplain again. He got kicked out of jump school, and I always wondered why he was so afraid of going to heaven. We were still plagued with high winds and even jumped once when we definitely should not have, and we ended up losing a lot of people due to broken bones. And I definitely call that a near-death experience. The worst jump of my life was my third jump. When I got close to the ground, I knew I was going way too fast and I thought I was going to die. And because I was still inexperienced, I pulled the wrong risers, which actually made me go even faster than slowing me down. And it was a really rough landing, but I was okay. It was sort of like falling off a motorcycle. My chute's canopy dragged me across the drop zone like a sail until I was able to collapse it by releasing one of my risers. And we lost about a third of the class to injuries. I successfully completed the rest of my jumps. I even got to jump out of a star lifter, which is a jet that you can now only see in a museum. The rest were dismantled. And after getting my wings, I went on to the Ranger indoctrination program and ended up hospitalized with pneumonia. Imagine trying to run 12 miles with 103-degree fever. I never even told anyone I was sick. I just woke up in a hospital bed one day. I think by then that was like the fourth or fifth near-death experience. So I went on to air assault school, where I learned how to rappel and fast rope out of Black Hawks and hook up sling loads to Chinooks. I almost fell out of a Black Hawk once, flying low and fast over a forest at night. That was terrifying and did nothing for my fear of heights. But remember that it's not brave if there is no fear. So at least I proved to myself that I was brave, that I could repeatedly face my fear and function well regardless. I sort of got what I wanted, but as I said, sometimes you're wrong about what you really want. And that was a hell of a realization after working so very hard and literally risking my life for it. I was even an M60 gunner. The M60 is the belt-fed machine gun that Rambo used. And my nickname was even Rambo. Not because of anything I said about Rambo, but just because I was so gung-ho about everything. We'd go on these long training rotations in the woods for a month at a time and coordinate these live fire exercises with Apache helicopters, and that was pretty miserable. No warmth, no showers, no good food, no sex, no movies, no games, no music, no nothing but surviving and training and waking up with your head in the snow. A month felt like a year. And I'd think back to when I was younger and wanted civilization to collapse and just quietly laughed at what a fool I was. Returning to civilization after training in the woods for a month was absolutely glorious. You do not want civilization to collapse. However bad you think it is now, trust me when I say it can get a lot worse. Eventually, I became very disenchanted with the military and found myself wanting to resist following orders. That's just not me, following orders, especially when they're the orders of people who are either incompetent or evil, because the price of their mistakes is my life or the lives of others, but never theirs. I remember a time when I was in MOUT training, which is military operations in urbanized terrain, basically learning how to fight in cities and clear buildings. And I asked the cadre questions about the rules of engagement, like the SOP on hostages and human shields and such. And I was told that if it was serious enough for us to be there, then hostages don't matter anymore. Just shoot through them. And it wasn't just the content of that statement that surprised me, but also the way it was said to me in such a casual, nonchalant manner. Well, just shoot through them. Like, why ask? Isn't it obvious? And I think that's when I stopped being an idealist. That was probably one of the great disillusionments of my life. But I don't want to throw anyone currently in the Army under the bus. I realize now that he was responsible for what he alone said. It was not an official doctrine of the Army. It was a personal conversation. Of course, it didn't help that he was an instructor. Also, bear in mind that this was still the 20th century, and I have no idea what the Army is like now. Not everyone in the military is guilty. But some of the things Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning exposed were not surprising to me. In the end, I didn't give a shit about having a military career after spending some time in the military and coming to the realization that Rambo should have taught me before I ever even enlisted. That I was just a tool, a pawn, a fully expendable chess piece of some comfortable politician sitting behind a big desk, and my death would just be a fraction of a number on a piece of paper buried somewhere on said desk. A buzzed head, indistinguishable among a field of buzzed heads, only to become a headstone indistinguishable among a field of headstones. And I knew that my life would be on the line not for the defense of my country, like the bullshit story they tell you, but rather for the interests deemed worthy by some completely immoral politicians in the pockets of corporations who especially don't give two shits about you. No, it was far more likely that rather than defend my country against foreign soldiers, I'd end up in someone else's country as a foreign soldier. There was no guarantee that even if you fought and died honorably, that you did so for a noble cause, because it's a cause someone else gets to decide. And you know what they use to get you to kill people in other countries? They use your camaraderie with your fellow soldiers because they become like family. So you're fighting for them. They put you all in danger, so you end up having to fight not for the people who put you there, but for your brothers, the people at your side fighting along with you. To them, you are obligated. And in that position, I could just as easily be used for an unjust cause as a noble one. Nothing more than hardware with a pulse. No different than a gun itself. A gun can be used to defend oneself or to commit murder. I had no say, and that did not sit well with me. I didn't want to be put in a position in which I'd have to unjustly take someone's life or lose my own life for a shitty reason because some politician sent me to some spot on a map, not as a soldier, but as a mercenary. Currently, the military struggles to recruit people, and I can see why. We need a military, but currently, I do not recommend joining the military. How do we solve such a conundrum? Well, by actually respecting the troops, not with platitudes, but by not putting them in harm's way for selfish reasons, and then claiming to honor them. Misusing their service does not honor them. It violates them and abuses their oath. Now, when people see that you actually value the troops and you don't misuse them, then they'll start signing up again, because it will be for a noble cause, the safeguarding of their country. I trained for the Bosnian conflict, which ended by the time my training was done. So through sheer blind luck, I was one of the last soldiers to serve during a very brief time of unique American peace. And I never had to kill anybody. And I'm very grateful for that now. Still, I was a very miserable young man, a warrior without a war, vulnerable to manipulation, and I ended up in the hands of people who did not give a shit about me except in whatever way they could use me for their own benefit. And as a result, I became even more miserable. And that's exactly what's happening to you now. There are modern social media recruiters, people selling you snake oil about what it means to be a real man, an alpha, what you should desire in life and how you should attain it and how you should treat women and that you are owed something. They're trying to sell you the idea that the American dream was stolen from you because of people who reject the old ways rather than the truth. And that truth is that we lost the American dream because the old ways simply played out to their logical conclusion, a pyramid scheme that exponentially rewards the greediest among us, a pyramid scheme that keeps us from rising against it by pitting us against each other, which is exactly why they recruit you. Be a soldier in their army and you too can be at the top of the pyramid. Well, that's a lie. Become the very thing that wronged you. If you can't beat them, join them. Well, they'll tell you that rather than being a slave, you should be a master. But it's impossible to have an army of masters. So why would they tell you such a thing if they want you to be their soldier? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's a lot easier to enslave people who believe they're free. If you can't see the prison, then you're not going to try to escape from it. The illusion of freedom is just a drug that controls you, but it's not the real thing. You don't really live in a free country. That's just a slogan. You can be a puppet on strings and still believe that you're doing everything you want to do, that it's all your decisions and nobody else's. It's the most manipulated people who are the last ones to realize that they've been manipulated. And if indeed you become among those who are the most manipulated, then you will be the most difficult to reach because others will have to work twice as hard to reach you. And that's because you won't have an empty glass. You'll have a glass that other people filled with dirty water, which others must empty before it can be filled with fresh, clean water. As Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. And perhaps that's because the latter requires the humility to admit when you're wrong. And humility is the opposite of what young men are encouraged to have. So they will be the hardest to convince that they've been fooled. Bear that in mind. You will be encouraged to listen to people who will sell you generational wars and gender wars and culture wars, constantly trying to recruit you for their wars. These people saturate social media. Do not buy it. Women are not your enemy. Black people are not your enemy. LGBT people are not your enemy. Yet there will be those who paint them all in the worst possible light, usually via the most uncharitable examples. You are sold the general idea that if there's room for them, then there won't be any room for you. That is a lie. You will be told that your preferred way of life is under attack by those people. That is a lie. That's just another way to keep us divided. Human beings are strongest when we're united. And those who have power keep their power by keeping their enemies weak. And they keep their enemies weak by dividing them and pitting them against each other. That's what's happening to us now. You can be traditional if you want, but that doesn't require demanding it of everyone else. Look at me. I'm nearly everything they tell you to unapologetically be. I'm a veteran. I carry a gun. I'm a straight white man, a landowner, a homeowner, a husband, a father, a weightlifter. On paper, I'm the perfect soldier for the traditional cause, but most of my friends are progressives. I'd venture to say that a lot of my hundreds of thousands of subscribers are progressives, and yet they accept me for who I am. They don't care that my life is traditional because I don't waste my life attacking them. Do you? Are you being encouraged to do so? By whom and why? Have you ever asked yourself these things? I've made mistakes in the past, yeah. I've said insensitive things in the past, and sure, some people have had problems with that, and in response it would have been very cheap and easy to turn my back on my values out of spite and become a successful grifter for those who want to sell you culture wars. But that's not who I am. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I did that, and in the end, progressive people still accept me for who I am. So I gotta say, when people claim that my way of life is under attack by them, by my own friends, it rings quite hollow. But then again, I have a lot of life experience and I know better, so I'm not exactly the target audience. You are. The young men of this world, a powerful force for their cause, who can be directed at an enemy who isn't really your enemy. You know what, though? My traditional way of life really is under attack, and so is yours. It's just not under attack by this demographic or that gender or this race or that sexual orientation. It's under attack by greedy corporatists who infect our politics and opportunistic lying influencers who infect our social fabric. They are the true constituents, not you. Their very existence centers around how much they can misdirect you and bleed you dry. And if that means sacrificing your way of life, if it means sacrificing the American dream, then they won't hesitate for a second. And they're so good at what they do that they won't have to do it by force. They'll convince much of the country to just hand it over voluntarily. They'll continue to have absolutely obscene relationships with your government and your most intimate fears, and you will let them do it. You know why? I'll tell you. Listen to me very carefully. It's because people have extremely poor risk assessment abilities. Against all rationality, people will fear being killed by a shark more than they will fear being killed in a car accident. You know why? Because they're used to cars. Cars are familiar things. And cars just don't seem all that dangerous, even though they're far more likely to kill you. But a shark is more of an unknown, and the unknown scares people. Likewise, never mind the dangers of the vultures robbing you of the American dream. You're used to those. But my God, what if there's a transgender person lurking in a bathroom, wanting to peek at your daughter? Your daughter, who is significantly more likely to be abused by a family member or a friend. Poor risk assessment, fear of the unknown rather than the known. For example, It's entirely plausible that you will live the rest of your days without encountering a transgender person in real life. But entire movies, documentaries, comedies, stand-up specials, laws, books, social media accounts, podcasts, and even beloved children's authors have been deranged to the point of hysteria, focusing on this extreme minority who is now significantly more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators of it. And while you're worried about them or whatever other bogus DEI, SJW, woke this or woke that has your attention, the American dream will continue to be robbed from you. Look at the jingling keys. Look at the flowers. Just keep listening to the culture war critics doing a meticulous census of every character in every movie or video game that doesn't fit the exact mold that you want them to. Surely that will make a difference in your life 30 years from now, and not the fact that you let the American dream be taken from you by the very people who recruited you into their army against the wokes. If you listen to my words right now and you still let it happen, if you listen to me warning you to get off the tracks because a train is coming, but you just stubbornly stay on the tracks anyway so that you can continue to complain about shit that will never affect your life in any meaningful way whatsoever, but will instead make you a menace to the lives of others, well, whose fault will it be when the train finally hits you? All across the political spectrum, there are those who are not the best of diplomats, and they can drive people away even if there's underlying truth to what they say. I know it can be exasperating to listen to people who know nothing about you tell you that you're privileged, or that you have generational guilt, or that you're the heir of atrocity, or a product of the patriarchy, or that your heterosexual titillations are problematic, that you're racist, sexist, or some sort of phobe. I know that when you hear those things, your initial urge may be to lash out or run off and seek solace with those who give you permission to be as bad as you want to be, to say whatever you want to whomever you want. And you can certainly do that. That's an option available to you. But how much discipline does that require? Exactly none. It's just pure indulgence and catharsis. It's instant gratification. The far more productive and mature response would be to honestly introspect about why that was said to you and if it applies to you. And if it doesn't, then disregard it. You don't have to use your accuser as a representative of a side and turn them into something more than they are. An excuse to run into the arms of their antithesis. Their enemy isn't necessarily your friend. And just because their enemy would welcome you with open arms, that doesn't mean they have your best interests in mind. They too have their taboos, don't be fooled. And if you say or do the wrong thing with them, you'll still get berated and lectured and canceled. Though with the lack of restraint that was the very reason you sought them out in the first place. They too can ideologically capture you and turn you into a fanatic. If you heard me say one of the trigger words earlier, like trans or woke or DEI, and all you wanted to do was pause the video and type an angry retort, then you're probably already captured. People tend to build a template of their enemy in their mind. And the template is an amalgamation of every offensive thing they've ever been told by various people they associated with a certain group. So if they associate you with that group, then they put the template on you, making you guilty of all sorts of things you've never done, said, or advocated for, and they'll make all kinds of bad assumptions about you, thinking that they know you, when in actuality all they're doing is berating a Frankenstein monster they've constructed in their head. People all across the political spectrum do that. It's part of human nature. It appeals to our tribalism. If that happens to you, the response should not be to just do the same thing to those you associate with them. That's why you should not hate anybody, because you tend to become like the people you hate. Rather than shaping yourself, you let people you hate shape you. You don't want to do that. So you don't want to be ruled or motivated by hatred. I was misguided when I was a young man. I wanted to be a badass. And even though I liked the idea of being a badass for my country, the truth was that even more than that, I wanted to be a badass for myself. And in the end, it came down to thinking that the only way I could matter to society is if society itself collapsed. And that's not what makes you a badass. That's not what makes you strong in a good way. They sell you this easy-to-believe lie that strong men create good times, and good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times, and bad times create strong men. What's the moral lesson there? That the fruits of good times are bad, and that the fruits of bad times are good? So what does that encourage you to create? The truth is, that's a fascist meme and a lie. Don't fall for it. The Mongols were strong men and they created hard times. The Nazis were strong men and they created very hard times. But there was a man who some would define as weak, as degenerate, a man who was rejected by those you might call strong. A man who was chemically castrated for being gay. But he was instrumental in defeating the Nazis and ushering in far better days. Being strong isn't enough. You have to know how to use your strength properly. That's what martial arts teaches you. The truth is that strong men can create the worst of times if they're misguided. So strong men need proper guidance. You have to know whether you're using your strength for good or evil. And that won't always be clear to you because people don't usually think of themselves as evil. Yet you will find that people can justify all sorts of evil if they think the ends justify the means. An important part of being a good man is focusing on duty rather than honor. Focusing on honor and being overly concerned about being disrespected will cause you to fall into the trap of conceit and self-centeredness. It'll cause you to have foolish pride, and that has only ever caused trouble. Foolish pride is what causes a man to get into a road rage incident in which he willingly risks the lives of his family 27 times because of a stranger who was a risk to them one time. If you focus on duty, honor will follow naturally without even paying attention to it. Do your duty. A strong man's duty is as a provider and a protector. A strong man lets the guy who cut him off go on his merry way because he doesn't want to put his family in any more danger or end up in prison where he can no longer protect his family. A strong man inspires others to do good. He is not a whiner, and he is not an entitled baby who wants to exploit others. That doesn't mean you should be forbidden from feeling or even showing emotion. That's not a weakness. No, it means having a mature attitude and recognizing that other people who are not like you exist and deserve a place in this world. A strong man does not attack the vulnerable. He protects the vulnerable. He isn't the villain. But he doesn't necessarily need to be the hero either. That doesn't mean you need to save the world. It can simply mean lending a helping hand. It necessarily means not using your strength to bully. That's not true strength. True strength is standing up to bullies. That's lending a helping hand. Lastly, but certainly not least, in order to have fulfillment in life, and I mean purposeful, meaningful fulfillment, you need to feel like you're accomplishing something good, working toward a goal. Even if you never achieve the goal, you can achieve fulfillment through working toward the goal. There are people throughout history who planned and worked their entire lives on projects they knew they would never finish in their lifetime. In fact, if you do reach your goal, you will find that quite counterintuitively, you will lose fulfillment. That's because fulfillment is found in the process of achieving rather than the achievement itself. Some people live their entire lives without learning that. And if you didn't know it, you may or may not realize that I just now told you one of the most important things you will ever hear. Fulfillment is found in working toward the goal, not achieving the goal. Now, that doesn't mean that achieving goals is bad. You should achieve goals, but do so with the understanding that you should have another goal afterwards. If you don't, the happiness and fulfillment you gain from the achievement will be short-lived, and you will become aimless and live a life of quiet desperation. That is true regardless of how much money you have. Robin Williams had faith, wealth, fame, family, and respect, everything everyone seeks in their life, and he hanged himself. Now, you may think that if there was no hope for him, then what hope could there possibly be for you? But that's wrong. We create our own challenges and our own purposes. It's not to be bestowed upon you by a deity, a relative, a boss, or an influencer. It's yours. You own it. And if you abstain from creating a purpose for yourself, or you delegate it to someone else, or allow someone to take it from you, then you will never truly be fulfilled.